So today, we're very happy to have two of our faculty from the Department of Environmental and Plant Biology and the College of Arts and Sciences, Associate Professors Kim Thompson and David Rosenthal. They're going to tag team, and they're going to tell us about planting rooftops around town, benefits and challenges of green roofs. And welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, we could probably talk for several hours, but we're going to keep it to one. So we do welcome your questions. There's quite a bit of information to cover and just lots of nuances on how green roofs are developed. So we hope that you'll enjoy the presentation. And so we'll go to the next slide.
All right.
I'm ready. Yeah.
That's my job tonight.
Right. So we're talking about green roofs around town, and we'll start with some that are on campus. And these are three. So Patton Hall, used to be McCracken Hall, I think was planted well before Schoonover. I'm not sure where this came in. Jeff Hall is a green roof, and it's over a utility tunnel. So though it doesn't look like a rooftop, it is officially a rooftop because it's over an open space and it has to be treated specially. Edwards Accelerator Lab is, this is a green portion that's over their particle accelerator. So that's also a green roof, even though it's on the ground. So you may not always recognize a green roof just by looking at it. But these are all green roofs. Anything that's over an open space is a green roof.
I have a question. Which is the oldest green roof on campus?
Jefferson Hall.
One for Jefferson Hall. Any other answers? Yes? Is that a fact?
I think so, because it's more than 50 years ago.
And so I was told to ask that question because it's in fact the accelerator lab. Sorry. 5 points for Gryffindor. All right.
So green roofs are a type of green infrastructure. And so very briefly, green infrastructure is a way to manage stormwater. And thank you. So these are a couple of examples. There are about 5 types of green infrastructure. Green roofs are one type. Some others are bioswales, as you see here. By the way, we've had a lot of student work that contributed to this project and to some of these slides. So Kai McKenney was a student who created a Map Athens tour, and so she took this photo here on Union Street. Rain barrels are also green infrastructure, and so is permeable pavement. And so they do not always involve plants, so you hear green infrastructure, but it is really about anything that manages stormwater runoff. And then tree plantings are another one. And then the fifth is green roofs. Rain gardens are also kind of included as a part of bioretention. That includes bioswales as well. So these are just some examples of green infrastructure. And so why do we want to manage stormwater runoff? Any ideas about?
To prevent flooding.
Prevent flooding, yeah, prevent flooding. That's a good reason.
Pollution getting into streams.
Pollution.
Great answer.
Yes. Prevent erosion, yeah. So, yeah, those are some great reasons. And if you go to the next slide, I think that shows our two, this is the Map Athens. So we wanted to let you know that if you are interested in finding out more about green infrastructure in particular, Kai McKenney, the student I mentioned previously, she created this Map Athens, and it's available through the Ohio Museum Center. I don't know if you want to show the link. And so you can go around town and see a variety of green infrastructure setups around campus and around town. And I'm sure we do not have everything that there is, but we did try to cover pretty comprehensively what's around town. So this is the Map Athens. If you haven't done this already, there are lots of great tours here. For art and history and birds and green infrastructure. So we're kind of at the bottom. Bugs, nature hikes. So this is a really nice resource.
How many of you have been to Map Athens and used that before?
Okay.
It's a great resource. You can do it while you're looking at it on your phone even, and walk around town, so it's
Yeah.
really interactive.
You can walk or drive depending on how long the tour is.
And we are here. Are we going through that?
That's us. So we're not going to go. I don't think we'll go to it. Oh, yeah, you were going to go to it.
Am I going to go to it?
Trying to remember our plans.
Let's check it out.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk in more details. But here it is. It was updated in April 20th, 2021. We wanted to highlight that it was this was all done by students. This was a PACE student, I believe.
So
Is
this
that right?
was just a student interested in working on a project. No course credit, no pay. She did this all on her own. And the photos were taken by different students, graduate students and undergraduates from Scripps College of Communications. So it's been a really nice interdisciplinary project. Our Green Roof project has been. We haven't really gotten into that so much yet, but we will next. And if you would just, yeah, I was going to say you could show our website as well. This is something you could just Google Schoonover Green Roof Project and find our website. And there's lots of information there if this inspires you to learn more.
Right.
We have flyers for classes and the projects that we've been working on in communications and engineering and research. So lots of good resources there. All right, so there are 3 different types of green roofs. These show 2 main types. So the extensive has less soil, and so it's going to hold less water but be less heavy. And its shorter plants are typical of that. So Patton Hall has mostly sedum, has some allium, and Schoonover Center is also extensive. And we were able to get an engineered soil that allowed us to plant grasses and meadow plants, so that was really nice. And then intensive is our sites where you have trees and shrubs and a variety. And then there's a third type, which is semi-intensive, so some of it is intensive and some of it is extensive. So this really depends on how much weight the structure can hold and really drives the design of the green roof.
So something I brought in for show and tell, and you can kind of pass these around as we talk, is I have 2 bags of soil here. I'll start with you, sir. And take a look at them. You can make a guess about which one might be a green roof substrate. We'll call it substrate. And the other one is a soil from a local site I'll tell you more about later.
Yeah.
I would have pictured coming into this that to call a green roof, it would be pretty much completely covered in green.
That's a great question.
Where it just seems like there's little areas that.
Can you repeat that?
Yes.
Just repeat the question.
So the question is, well, the expectation was that a green roof would be completely covered rooftop with greenery. But the one that we're showing has a lot of bare spots, and we will actually talk about that. So you can see here these weirs, these white structures. This really was designed around those because this is a research and educational facility. So yes, we could have planted the entire rooftop, but because we wanted to use it for research, we had to set it up so that we could collect data. So that's why it looks like that. But that's a great observation.
Yeah, even in this intensive green roof, which is at the Holzer Clinic, maybe you've seen this. How many of you have seen this at the Holzer Clinic? It's actually really an impressive space. It really looks almost like a little garden on top of a building, and it's really pretty great. But you can also see that even in this design, there's clearly some tiles here. So not entirely green space.
And that also goes to the design. This was designed for staff and for patients to come out and enjoy that space. They have a picnic table there, so people eat out there sometimes. So you want to design it for whatever functions you want to have there. So that would change the design as well, just like ours was for research. Patton Hall, it's all green in their green roof area. It's next to a place where they have picnic tables and students can sit out there and study and eat. But the green roof portion is really all green, like you just described. Yes?
I have a question from online. How much weight can a green roof hold?
So that's part of the driver of the design. The minimum is 20 pounds per square foot of vegetation, and that really is thinking about the water that's going to be held there. So that's what has to be calculated. So the rooftop, it depends on how it's designed, how the structure is designed, how much weight you can put on it. So once again, you have to look at what is your purpose for putting this on, what do you want to do with this green roof, and that is going to really influence the entire design process, from the building itself to the green roof part. Now, I'll say that Schoonover Center was already designed to have a green roof on it, so that wasn't part of our consideration. We already knew this has 20 pounds per square foot for vegetation. So that had already been designed, it just had not been planted, and it had been 5 years since it had actually been built before we started working to get that planted.
So that was a great question because I had passed around these bags of soil and substrate. And did you notice any differences between these two? The weight, right? And so what I'll have you know is that the volume in these two bags is actually identical. But the density, or the bulk density, as we describe soil, is much greater in a natural prairie site, which is what we see here, versus this. But the volume is identical. And so that's a point made in terms of the limitations of weight on any building, right? Mm-hmm. All right.
Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So I'm looking for my, yeah. Can you go to the next one?
Sure.
I wanted to see where maybe we left it out. Okay, you can go back. I was looking for the two buildings, one unplanted and one planted. If we had that. Because I wanted to ask the question, what's the advantage of having a green roof? And some of these aspects you already mentioned, but let's just discuss again, why would we want to put a green roof on a building? Yeah, David.
Two reasons that Edwards has a green roof is that we want radiation shielding both from inside and outside, and it also insulates the building. We hardly use any heating at all in the winter. In fact, we have to have an air conditioning system right up and running.
Right. So it really helps with that energy, control of energy, insulation, and reflecting the heat, shading the heat. I realize now why I didn't have that, because we were going to talk about that later. Sorry, we have so much to talk about, so. Anybody else?
I mean, I had a question about the soils right before, and we
good.
kind of moved past it already, but I was wondering if, because you were saying there's a benefit to having the lighter, this larger grain size and having it lighter and all that, but is there an issue with like nutrients in the soil or anything that you're missing out on that?
Well, it's not, let's not call this soil. This is really a substrate. It's essentially mostly perlite, which is inert and inorganic. And so when this is laid out, this is really just a placeholder for stuff. And when this green roof was built, the company that installed it had a proprietary organic mixture that they laid on top of this. That included seeds and nutrients, among other things, and slow-release fertilizers. And so all of that was sort of built into the structure when it was built. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. Gotcha.
But as a follow-up to that, I would say that, as to my knowledge, we have not added any nutrients or fertilizers to this roof since it was planted in the summer of 2020.
And that's a really important question, because if you do add fertilizers, then you can put pollutants into the water when it does move off of there, because that can lead to algae blooms and things like that. So that's a really important question about should we be fertilizing, and there's a lot of research being conducted on that right now, on what effect does it have to fertilize a green roof. So this is...
I think there's a question.
Oh, sorry, David.
What's the comparative water retention between those two materials?
You know, I haven't done that quantitative analysis, so I can't answer that with any degree of precision. But I know that this actually holds water in excess of what you would expect based on its volume, right? It also doesn't hold water as tightly as clays. So clay soils have a tendency to hold on to water, so you have to actually add more water to clay for the plants to be able to get the water out of it. Whereas this is has a lower water potential in terms of its potential energy of holding that water in. So there's a trade-off there, because in weight by volume, this can't actually hold as much water, but it's more readily available to the plants. And so that also feeds into the idea of not being too heavy when it's saturated. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
And there are a lot of other factors, too, that influence how much water can be held by the system, including the types of plants that you use. So this is our design, and this, again, was created by a student at Scripps. So Brooke Stanley made this according to what we actually have on the Schoonover green roof. And so you see at the bottom is the membrane, that's the white part. There's the scale here on the bottom left. So there's some drainage happening. We want to make sure that water doesn't settle and sit on top of the membrane. It does drain, and it's held in the substrate as much as can be held there. And so there's some drainage layers. There's a root barrier so that we do not have roots growing into the membrane. And then we have this growing medium, which we're calling substrate. It's also been called engineered soil, so something like that. We have irrigation in our system. That's, of course, optional, but it does help with the success of the green roof. And then we have vegetation. So there's a variety of layers that we need to create this green roof. And this is what ours is. There's also a display right outside the green roof. You can go to Schoonover, you can look at the green roof. You can't go out onto the green roof without somebody who's involved in the project. It's restricted. But there's a nice display that describes what's happening there.
That's actually a good point about the reason it's restricted is not because we don't want you out there, but because you can only have so many people up there at once because of the weight requirements and restrictions on the roof, which is 20 pounds per square inch, right?
20 pounds per square foot.
Or 20 pounds per square foot. And so after the roof had been installed, it was estimated that we could only have 4 or 5 people on there at once.
So question, for the majority of roofs on campus, like Baker Center, what would be its capacity?
That would have to be determined by a structural engineer. So when we first started this project, we asked facilities to give us a list of what are all the capacities of each building on campus, and essentially we were told, we don't know. We don't have that information. So you can hire a structural engineer and determine that. Baker, I'm not sure about Baker, but I do know that older buildings that have concrete rooftops are probably more likely to be able to be planted. They would be more likely to have the structural capacity. I've had a couple people contacted me last year and said, hey, I'd love to put a green roof on my patio. Can you come and do that with your students? And I say, no, because we don't know what your weight capacity is, and you can't put plants just anywhere.
Well, if you could do a green roof on Baker, there's an 1804 fund waiting for
I
you.
think we've talked about this before, so yes, I have thought about it.
That'll be phase 2 of the green initiative. Are there any other questions about this graphic since it's up? No?
All right, so how do we do this? We said we're going to talk about benefits and challenges, and we thought we'd ask you to consider, and some of this we've already touched on because your questions are so wonderful. So how do we do this? What are some challenges? Why aren't we doing this everywhere? Yeah. Say it again.
A lot of roofs probably don't even have much flat space. Just due to the
Oh, that's a great point. So they may not have flat space. You can have a green roof on a slope. There's a limit, and you have to set it up a certain way. But there are sloped green roofs. So it has to be designed a little bit differently. But that is definitely a possibility, so I'm glad you brought that up.
So yeah, in urban environments, most of the routes are flat, and this is where this idea, I think, really it was initiated because it's a flat space that sort of lends itself to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you do about the invariable amount of snow
Snow?
that accumulates just
Yeah, so that's a great, when a rooftop is designed, so the question was, sorry, Rox, the question was, what do you do about snow weight? How do you account for that? That's actually already considered when you build a rooftop, because there's a certain amount of snow that's going to sit on a rooftop anyway. So that's part of their calculations when you design the roof itself. So that's not really an extra. The water that could melt, the precipitation from snow, could still be held the same as rainwater would be held. It's a good idea, especially as we're getting into winter.
Well, I imagine it must be fun getting everything up there and organized.
Getting everything up there, yeah, so that's a challenge. Maybe you saw the top right screen there.
Right. So that takes some planning. It requires some expense. You know, it's expensive to put a green roof on a building, and that's why it wasn't done before we raised the funds to get this done on Schoonover, because it was costly. So, yeah, it costs money to put that structure together.
So
And you can see here the design, right? You need an architect to design it. We had to bring in people to install it. We had to have a crane put things on top of the rooftop. You can see the actual, this drone shot here when it was right before it was being installed. So we have irrigation being added. We had to add a lot to the outside of Schoonover too to make it safe, because it's an educational facility. So we needed emergency lights, and we needed a faucet and electricity and things like that we had to add. So it can cost money.
And another consideration that I don't know that we've mentioned is that, and Dr. Thompson mentioned this, right? So the Schoonover was built with the intention of there being a green roof there. Mm-hmm. And it only happens to be a couple stories off the ground, so we were able to do it post hoc, right? After the fact, this was possible. But in a much larger or taller building, you would imagine that would be prohibitively expensive, right? Because you'd have to bring it in by helicopter potentially, or it would take a long time, a lot of elevator trips to get all of the hardware up there. So that's one possibility. Yeah.
So why not just a lot of planters that somebody, would that be easier? I mean, instead of designing this, would it be just easier to set out a whole bunch of planters with whatever you wanted to do?
Instead of doing it on a roof, you mean? Well, we have
on the roof even. I mean,
so, I'm sorry.
could you just set out, instead of designing it this way, could you just set out planters?
Oh, I see what you're
on top of
saying.
the roof and
Well, it depends on how heavy they are. So that's part of the design constraint. So there are systems that are plastic trays. In fact, that's what was used at Jeff Hall. So they use trays, and then you just lay them out there. And that's more expensive to do it that way compared to the way that we did it. So there are a lot of different design opportunities in green roofs. Again, it depends on what you want. Do you want it to be easy? We're just going to come up, everything's already planted, it's growing. We seeded ours, so that would be another option. Do we bring in full-grown plants? Do you put in seeds? So a lot of that has to do with the cost that you're looking for and what do you want down the road. I was told I met with a number of vendors before we even got Schoonover, and one person said the trays are, they're extra money, and they're plastic, of course, and it's not any easier to take it out if there's a problem. So suppose you end up having a leak and you have to take the green roof off. So you think, well, it'll be easier to pull a tray out. And in fact, it's not. You could just cut out what you need and take that apart. So I didn't really see an advantage of the trays. I would imagine if you have planters, depending on what you're planting, it could be more expensive. So if you're looking at the lower level, that would be trays. That's a good question. It seems like that would be easier. Yeah.
So would part of the benefit of the infrastructure be that the roots are growing and more established? Would that help with mitigating energy loss as opposed to just putting planters?
Again, it depends on the type of planter that you're putting in there. So if either way, you're going to have something underneath the plants. You can't have the plants directly on the membrane, because then you run the risk of damaging the membrane. So there's going to be some kind of insulation there and the root barrier to protect the membrane.
Actually, in this picture here, what you're seeing are giant, these are 8x4, or they were 4x8 sheets of insulation. And so those are laying on top of the roof and above the membrane, but below what's effectively actually a planter. We're talking about, we're sort of, these trays are effectively really large planters in a sense, right? They're just custom designed. But yeah, so that's the insulation right there. And Kim would be happy to tell you a story about how they all blew away after the professionally paid installers just left these light styrofoam blocks on the roof. And
with bags of water. That was how they were holding them down. And I went out and I was checking our time-lapse camera because I wanted to make sure to capture the installation on time-lapse. And I'm looking at the time-lapse footage to make sure it's all set up properly. And I see, wait a minute, there are things blowing that I didn't notice. And I went out there and some of these had kind of blown around. And I was out there on Friday night, like putting everything back together. Just part of a job as a professor.
I remember when you came to the research division for funding for the green roof, one of the hardest things was actually just trying to get people to understand what a green roof was and what were the potential issues with it, but also what weren't. There was a lot of, well, what if this happens? And what if this happens? There was just a lot of uncertainty at that point. It was new. It was new technology to the university. And I remember facilities not exactly being on board at first.
And I think one of the big concerns that they had was that this is an educational institution, and what good is this going to be? We can't have more than 4 people out there at a time. It's not going to be useful for education, and we really had to convince them that this is going to be used for education. It is going to be used for research. And we have proven that over and over again, that it has been a wonderful interdisciplinary project, but that was a big concern. Why would we spend money on a green roof, which has its own, there are reasons to do that outside of the education piece, but why would we spend money on this instead of another classroom or something in a classroom? So we really had to do a lot of convincing that this is educational. And here we are. So.
what else? Other challenges? I think we've kind of covered this.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, sorry, I went ahead. I'm used to doing this in a different order, so I like to show this photo on the left of the planted Schoonover Center and this on the right, and think about why should we plant a rooftop? And we haven't covered everything yet, so I still feel okay about asking this question. So what have we mentioned already? Why would we plant a rooftop? It's more expensive. There are challenges. Why do it then? What's the point?
Maybe beyond what we've already talked about. Yeah.
Oh, that's such a great way to say this. There's a capacity
yeah,
to do this. So the point was, the space is there. It was taken away from what was previously natural space at some point in time, so why not put that back? And that is the perfect way to say that here we have this unused landscape, and about 25% of an urban area or urbanized area, which Athens is, we have a lot of buildings, is rooftop. So we could plant 25% of our landscape if we planned it right. So yeah, we're taking unused space and planting it. Why not? That's great. So what advantage then does this have to have this planted space? Why not? Why is that better than having this empty white space?
Corridor for pollinators.
Pollinators, yeah, provides habitat. Pollinators and other animals. What else?
Let me ask a follow-up question.
I mean,
Say it again.
The aesthetics of it. It just
Aesthetics.
looks nice.
It's prettier. When we were planning this, and Scripps College was wonderful, the School of Media Arts and Studies were wonderful, really excited about us doing this, and they were like, when are you going to plant this? Because we cannot stand this white, glowing rooftop, especially the people who had offices all around there. They were really excited about it. So aesthetics. nature has been shown to improve productivity of workers, students. So there have been some studies on that, specifically around green roofs.
Are you going to talk about pollinators?
Maybe.
Yeah, we'll show some pictures. You were leading us to that.
There's a question back
Yeah.
So I know that there's a lot of bird species that are really affected by things in Athens, like cats that are everywhere, or all of these ground animals that are everywhere. So have you seen any like influx of birds in the green roofs, or is that a unique environment for other things?
Yes, there are birds there. And I have a student I just met with today who is going to do a bird study. We have a game camera there, so we've been observing birds. I was first observing birds on the roof just because I would go out there and I'd see them fly up out of the beds. And so then I put a game camera up there. So this student is actually going to work on analyzing that footage to see who's there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because Dr. Rosenthal's students have done some work that'll be connected. And then the other thing we learned was that often when you have green space, birds come along. You mentioned cats, so definitely cats aren't going to be up there. But birds hit windows. So they're attracted to the green space. So when I learned that, I got some bird film, and we put that up on all the windows. I got permission from all of the faculty there, who had the windows. They chose the design so that they would be happy. And you don't even really notice it now. So that helps prevent bird hits, because we don't want to attract animals there and then hurt them. What else? So think about green infrastructure. What is the purpose of green infrastructure? We did hear habitat first, and I predicted that, right?
Well, I think we've heard a lot of the answers so far.
Yeah.
Produce oxygen.
Produces oxygen. It's another plant resource. Provides that ecosystem service.
What else do plants do? Producing oxygen is really just a byproduct.
Yeah.
I guess it's going to buffer water runoff.
Mm-hmm. Water runoff. So that is what green infrastructure is designed to do. Green infrastructure is designed to slow down and store stormwater runoff. So you can see right here that there are drains, and you need the drains because you don't want water sitting on the roof, right? So, but if you can store it in greenery and soil, then you are not going to have so much going out into a system that could lead to flooding. So that was mentioned earlier, the flooding. And carrying pollutants was also mentioned. If you have something on pavement, on parking lots, on rooftops, any kind of impermeable structure, which this is, then it's going to carry all those pollutants with it. But if you have plants there, it's going to hold the water, and it's not going to move those pollutants into the stormwater system. So bioswales, for example, which you may have noticed are now all up and down Stimson Avenue. There are a lot of bioswales. That really helps hold that water so it's not going to our water treatment facility with dog waste and pesticides and fertilizers and oil that's dripped from your car. All that gets carried into our system. So you can see what's happening here on a rainy day before it was planted.
Well, and roofs are notoriously hot also, so is it cooler?
What's that?
Roofs are notoriously hot and reflect
Oh,
a lot of
yes.
heat, so does it keep the temperature, makes it cooler in that area?
Especially black rooftops, they are very hot. Yes. So it will definitely cool down. Plants are always good at cooling areas. So this is a rainy day, and this was after we'd installed the time-lapse camera, so it's a little bit different orientation here. But now it's also going to rain on this day. You can kind of see, you'll see lightning. What's the difference?
So where's the water going now? Right? The plants and the soil and the trays are essentially that surface where all that water was just running right off. And so this is a really clear example of that. It's something that we knew was going to happen, but this illustrates to what extent that can minimize it. And you can get pretty good estimates in terms of how much runoff is captured by green roofs depending on the area covered, right? Oh, that picture's there in case the video didn't work.
And we'll talk about these flumes in a little bit too. So lots of research has been done because this is a green infrastructure strategy. Does it actually hold stormwater? How much? What is the difference? So this was a study done in 2018 by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And you can, if you look at the chart, you see the amount of precipitation is, of course, the same, whatever the roof is. And then the runoff differs between these two rooftops. What do you notice?
Yeah, it's an order of magnitude difference, right? 10 times less runoff.
So it is holding a lot of water. And again, this does depend on the type of substrate you use, the type of plants you use. Some plants hold water in their canopy a little better than others. Some evapotranspirate faster, so they can take up more water more quickly. So in the end, they're going to hold more water. So there's a lot of variability here. Yeah.
So I'm not too knowledgeable on how plants kind of get rid of pollutants once they're in the soil, but what happens if there's a lot of pollutants that then get into these rooftop gardens? Do you have to go out and like change the soils so the plants don't die, or like what's the move with that?
That's a great question.
So are you asking about whether the soil needs to be replenished? Is that what you're asking?
Partially, yes.
I think,
okay.
If like you have the same plants over and over again as well.
Okay, so what you're getting into is actually a really, I think, the interesting part of this, and kind of what we're looking at in my lab, which is really the development of soil. So when this green roof was planted, and by the way, that green you're looking at is actually a biodegradable netting. You've probably seen these on the sides of roads when they cover bare ground to try to get it to revegetate. It's similar to that, and below that is the organic material. But your question about the soil is that, so this is inert. It effectively had no organic, nothing really living in it. And so the plants that are growing there are actually contributing to that. So we wouldn't want to change that. In fact, over time, it's only going to get better is the expectation. Does that make sense? Okay, so does that answer your question?
But I think he's asking about pollutants. And so that actually has been an area of study because plants take up pollutants. And plants also aren't very happy when they are taking up pollutants. They don't grow as well. It does affect their growth. So you can think about them we're actually studying this on this green roof, what's the change in air quality. So there is a question, if the pollutants go into the plants, does that then run off into the water anyway at some point? And that is an area of study. It's a great question. So it's some plants, some toxins, some pollutants can be inactivated by plant and microbe activity, so that may be happening. It's a very complicated question.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
how many species did you start with? And how many species do you have now?
Yeah, Dr. Rosenthal will know that
Well,
one.
so we can jump ahead a couple slides if you want to actually get to that. So what we did was we looked at what was here and some associated species. But to kind of get to your question, this is a study that an undergraduate student did last year that kind of gets to your point. We were given a list of potential species that might be in our mix, right? So we didn't really know what was going to come up. And so what Marissa did is she went out, and this wasn't an exhaustive study. It wasn't for the whole year. So it's really a snapshot of the species that are there. And our seed mix had more than 19 potential species in it. But 19 of those showed up. Does that make sense? So that's what this is saying. And of course, our seed mix was only native species. It was called the native prairie seed mix, right? And then what we found is that there were other species there, which maybe gets to that too. And so this habitat was created, and there was an expectation of certain plants coming up, and they did. But we also got some volunteers. And so these were plants that were not part of the mix, and so had to come somehow. And so what I asked Marissa to do was sort of take a look at which ones were native, which ones weren't. And so she broke it down, and what we found was there was a good deal of non-native volunteers. what kind of plants do you think those are? Can you think of a plant that might just be able to get to a rooftop?
Probably invasives.
Who said that? They weren't all invasive, but they're all non-native, and they are weedy by nature. And so what's the most common weed you can imagine?
Dandelion.
You know, there are no dandelions up there. Have you seen any?
I don't think so.
I haven't seen any dandelions.
Well,
That's
thistle.
kind of interesting.
Anything come in from birds, from
Birds.
seed mixes?
Yeah.
Potentially, right?
I'm
so
sure.
I haven't seen sunflowers yet. Have you?
Or
Like the common
safflower.
sunflower?
I get a lot of safflower
No
in my
safflower.
native
Okay.
garden due to birds.
But
Mostly what I saw were grasses. The grasses, they're wind-blown seeds, very lightweight, so those can move pretty easily. And even the first month after it was planted, I saw grasses that I thought, okay, foxtail, other kinds of things that weren't necessarily included in the mix.
Yes, so volunteer. So one of the things that was in the mix was an annual grass. It was not wheat.
Switchgrass.
Switchgrass is still there. That's a perennial. But
A rye or
rye or something like that.
Yeah.
And so that was just there to establish, and then it disappeared,
Yeah.
or some of it reseeded. But most of the plants that are there now, obviously, are perennials, and they're for the most part native. One thing I don't think I have that.
And if
here.
we have
Yeah.
invasives, we will be removing them. That's something that we are committed to because we don't want to, this is supposed to be a healthy ecosystem, so we're managing it.
Yeah, and so I don't have that data here. Unfortunately, what I was going to show you was the kinds of ways that plants are spread around, right? The way they disperse, and about 60% of these volunteers are wind-dispersed plants. So, like a dandelion, things that are light seeds that can be easily transported through wind vectors. There is actually one plant up there, and I can't think of the name right now.
Did you get pokeweed?
No pokeweed yet.
Birds bring pokeweed.
No pokeweed yet.
What about maple
But
seeds?
there's one mammal dispersed plant up there, and I'm pretty sure we're the ones that brought it up there because I have the only other. Well, we do have another mammal that's up there.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have had a bat, but we.
Yeah, we've had bats,
Yeah.
but I don't think the bat would have dispersed this. It's one of the. It's a seed with a burr. You know, the kind you get on your clothes when you. It wasn't trefoil. I can't think of the name now. But another weed, for sure. So that was your question about weedy species.
Yeah. Question.
So since we're talking about birds and the bees, as it were, so this is interesting. So another student, Alberta Dempsey, was interested in understanding what plants were there and their associated creatures based on the literature. And this is, anybody recognize that purple flower? Coneflower, right? And so these are the different kinds of creatures that are associated with coneflower. And we all love the monarch and these beautiful other butterflies. But what I thought was really cool about this is after Kim and I were talking about this presentation, and you saw a goldfinch up there, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely goldfinches there.
So it's one thing for us to say this is what we expect to see, but it's even cooler when we see what it is we expect. These pictures weren't taken on the green roof, I must say.
Yes.
When you're looking at what you're planting there, it looks like you have a lot of different species. Are all of those thriving, or are there some limitations with like your soil depth and the weird temperature of roofs that kind of specify what can actually thrive?
That's a great question. And the design, the group that installed the green roof considered this is the climate that we have. And the climate on a rooftop can be different than the climate on the ground, too. There's microclimate effects. So what's going to grow here? So they're specialists in this area. They chose plants that would grow in this part of the world and would grow in this level soil, under these conditions. So, You might have a better idea if there's some things that never came up. We did have some bare areas, and we reseeded it, then the irrigation wasn't working, we're out there hands-on. We had a few issues, but things are starting to spread out even within the beds. If there was an area that was bare, now in our second, I think we've had 2 full years now, they're starting to spread around. So they're doing well.
I'd like to say that I've seen, or we've had reports, I haven't seen all these, sometimes it's a student that reports it, so I have to take their word for it. But I think everything that we expected to see has come up at least at some point during the process, right? What I'm trying to do is get a better picture of this, and I have another student working on it this year, and she is going to be doing a quantitative assessment of plants over time, because all of the studies we've done so far are short snapshots, and that's because it's a pay student and they can only work this many times, and so we're kind of limited by that. So we're trying to get a picture of what's there for a whole year, because I think we're going to get some of the early species that we haven't gotten, and some of the ones, most of the ones that are still flowering late in the fall are easy to get because students are always around. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. So these are some of the habitat always comes up first because people often think of that when they think of plants, and that's really important supporting ecosystem service that plants provide is habitat. So here are some, these were all taken on the green roof. The bat on the left was one that I found within about a month of the time that we planted, and I accidentally found it when I pulled a rock out, and I was like, oh my God, there's a bat here. So we're already providing habitat. That was a really good feeling. So there it is on this rock. We put a bat house up on the green roof. I had students come together and build from kits from this conservation group. Bat houses, 1 is on the green roof, and then we have 5 on the ridges. None of them have yet been used, and it's the 2nd season, so they should come in the spring. Bats would come in the spring and use them as nursery places. But a bat has been there, and they are around campus. We know that. This is a grasshopper. The bees, and then the goldfinch you can kind of see there in among the greenery. This is from the game camera, so it's not the best quality photo. And the praying mantis that was taken on Patton Hall by one of the students who helped create a video tour of the Green Roof Project, and I love this photo of this praying mantis. So you can see there's vegetation will also influence kind of who comes around. And now that we have a bird study, we're really interested to see if the birds are we gonna have migrators coming through, and who's coming through temporarily, who's just coming for the summer, who's here all year round. So lots of great questions we can ask about that. We also see, this is a bee house in the center here, bottom, that a student created. He built this with his dad. He was very interested in arthropods. He started this arthropod project. And so this is the first year after 3 that this was actually occupied. So this is for solitary bees. They're native bees, and they will overwinter here. And you can see that they're covered up now with some kind of material, so they put that in there. These 2 students are collecting samples of arthropods that we collected on the green roof, and there's a picture under a microscope of one on the far left there. It looks like it's holding a little larva or something in its feet, so we're still working on identifying those. These students are working on a microbiome project, so we're looking at, Dr. Rosenthal mentioned that the soil, the engineered soil that was provided was, organic matter was added to it, but they also claimed that they put this microbial community in there, so that really got me interested, and we started immediately collecting soil samples to find out what's there, when they first put it in, and then a year later, what do we see? So we're still working on that data with a professor and grad student in bios. You can see the bat house kind of all the way in the back on that building. These are 2 students who were looking at the air quality sensor. So we're looking at particulate matter, kind of goes to the question that you had asked about pollution. So is the air quality improved? So we have air coming into the roof, and there's a sensor there picking up particulate matter, and then there's a sensor on the wall, so we can kind of figure out, is there a difference between these 2 areas? And I work with a engineering faculty member to try to figure out what is a good sensor, what should we be measuring. And then you can see Dr. Rosenthal's master's student here working on this carbon flux study. So we're looking at biological studies, Water runoff and quality, which we really haven't covered yet, but that is being explored. How much water is being stored? What is the quality of the water as it leaves? That's being done by Dr. Cruz and Voinovich. Air quality, energy exchange, what's the temperature difference and how is that affecting radiation? So those are all some studies that are being done. I don't know if you want to talk about the carbon
Can I get in a question from online?
Sure.
They wanted to know, do you have a source of water on your roof? As water sources are known to bring in animals, creatures, etc.
Oh, okay. So we have water coming out onto the roof. We had to add that. It's non-potable water. We don't have water for, I think the question then is, do we provide water for birds and insects?
Birds, butterflies, dragonflies.
So there is water that kind of pools around the drains. We are not providing like a bird bath or anything like that. There is water that pools around the drains, and I have seen birds there around that water. So this is a question this student just asked me today who's going to be working on the bird project. Maybe we'd get more birds there if we provided some water. So that's a question we can ask. It requires some maintenance. You have to be up there regularly enough to make sure the water is still there for them. You don't want to provide something and then take it away later. But we've really tried to keep this pretty natural, except for the research that we're doing. And in fact, because somebody asked about the health of the plants, we didn't do any irrigation this summer at all because we had a pretty good summer and we were concerned that it might interfere with one of the studies that was going on, so we kind of took a chance and really didn't irrigate anything all summer and still had pretty good success with the plants.
So that's a good segue for that. That's BJ on the top left, BJ Gurung. He's a master's student in my lab. He's actually collecting biomass, that is basically all the clippings of growing material on the surface to estimate the amount of carbon that's been taken up by that per unit area. And so that's part of this carbon uptake and sequestration question, which we haven't really talked about. So there's all these benefits that have been determined with green roofs, but the remaining question is, in terms of the biology and maybe, say, climate change, one of the major pollutants of climate change is CO2, right? And what happens to CO2 when it comes in contact with a plant during the day? You guys remember? Anybody? It's this process. Photosynthesis. Give the man a t-shirt. And so plants take up carbon from the atmosphere. So one of the pollutants they do and can take up and like to take up is carbon dioxide. And so what BJ's doing is trying to assess how much carbon they're taking up on an annual basis. How does that compare to a natural ecosystem, for instance? And can I show them this one here? Yeah, okay. This is really the only data slide for today's presentation. And what it's really, essentially it's a synthesis of the total amount of biomass, that is the stuff we clipped in per unit area, on the green roof for 2 years and on the natural prairie site. I'm calling it a natural prairie site, but it's a prairie site near the student farm. And so it is a non-managed grassland that's actually it's actually mowed once a year. And so what we're looking at is the amount of biomass in both sites. So what do you notice right away about the green roof compared to a natural prairie? Okay, not as much, right? And so that's not entirely surprising. The prairie's been growing and is in a great soil, a rich soil that used to be farmland, and it's been doing that for about 10 years. It hasn't been, it's been managed as a prairie for the last 10 years. What you can also know is it varies year to year. But what we can do from this is we can start getting an answer to, well, what's the carbon benefit of the green roof? And so what we did was, and I just did this back of the envelope calculation a couple days ago because BJ just finished processing the 2022 data. To make a long story really short, the payback time in terms of the carbon cost of building the green roof is about 30 years. That's what we've gotten so far based on these data. So based on the amount of carbon used to transport stuff there, the raw materials, all of that part of it. So the carbon payoff's about 30 years. What was the energy
So can you go back to the slides we missed with the infrared? Because I wanted to talk about that, because this is somewhat related to our climate mitigation strategies. So you'll notice on the right, this is an infrared image of the same buildings that you see on the left. So on the left, this is Chicago City Hall. There are a lot of green roofs have been installed in Chicago, Toronto, New York City, big cities that really have problems with stormwater runoff, but also are making it, putting in a lot of incentives to have people put green roofs on. So you see the Chicago City Hall green roof there. And then what do you notice about the difference in temperature? Because this has been mentioned a couple of times now. It's a lot cooler, right, where there's greenery. So this is, okay, so it's cooler on top of that roof. Again, who cares? I'm not on the roof. What do I care if it's cool? It could affect the city. You can have the entire city cool off if you have enough green roofs planted. So it affects the air temperature of a broader area if you have, if you scale up. How about that building that we saw too? Is there any effect on the building? We see the rooftop is cooler. How does that affect the building?
Cool it down.
It can cool it down. And often that's really on the top floor, so it's not good, depending on the size of the building envelope. You might have some cooling. It depends on how much insulation there is already, so again, a lot of variability. If you cool the building on a hot day, you use less energy, you save money, and if your energy is coming from fossil fuels, you are emitting fewer greenhouse gases. So I'm not sure if that's considered in that budget, right? But that's another way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is by the energy. It is, okay.
I just wanted to interrupt and say you have 3 minutes left, so you might want to turn it over to the audience for questions.
Thank you so much. I had a feeling that was going to happen.
Does the audience have questions? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have a slide you were on that started with a bullet about replacement of the roof? It's a few slides
the UV, yeah,
down
so
from this, I think.
the other benefits, I think, is where it is.
Maybe you're going the wrong way. I think
I'm going the wrong way.
I think it was a later
It's
slide.
farther. It's where it says other benefits. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, this is a good
So
summary
your
slide.
first bullet is a point I wanted to ask about. The impact of all this on roof replacement. Says it can make it last longer. I could see that if it were covering most of it, that maybe it makes it last a whole lot longer because it's really not exposed to the elements. But in the case of partial growing, portions of that roof are not covered. They're going to need to be replaced. Take the Schoonover case, wouldn't the whole thing need to be disassembled, taken off for them to do a roof replacement, all put back in place? Is that true?
Right, and so that's exactly the question I have. And I think that's so interesting. The question is about, it has been well established that it will double the lifespan of a roof if you have the whole thing planted. So I'm really curious about that same thing. We did not plant the entire roof. We have bare spots. And that membrane is being exposed to UV radiation, to heat stress, so may not protect our roof longer because of the way we have it designed.
Other questions? We have time for one.
Like I said, we could talk for hours about this. So come up and talk to us personally if you want to, or contact us. Check out our website. Lots of information there.
I do have one question then just to end. How many students have done some type of educational research project on your green roof?
Yeah, it's hard to come up with numbers because we have so many different faculty. So we have, I think, 8 different colleges, departments, schools, have been working on this with multiple students involved. So I'd say hundreds have been involved in some capacity. Maybe they attended a class where they learned about it. I've gone to a learning community and talked about green roofs. We've done lots of outreach to the community. Students have gone and done outreach to kids and bring little green roof models. We gave 8 big green roof models that engineering students designed. And now we have Patton College engineering education students developing lesson plans for those students. So there's just it's been a huge project.
Well, thank you very much. Let's thank our speakers.
Thanks for coming. Really
Thanks for
appreciate it.
coming on this Wednesday during exam week. Really appreciate it.
Some of you don't have to worry about that, we can tell.